once in a while, I'd be on the train with somebody near somebody reading my column. And like sometimes you'd see people laughing, and no feeling is better than that.
Yeah.
Other times, very much the opposite.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. We can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what's your genre, tell me what do you do. I'd like to know the things that specifically make you.
Hey, I'm Tim Barnes. You are The Genre. And in every episode of this show, I ask a great guest about the first genre that inspired them, the first craft they pursued, and how they feel about that first pursuit now. Why do I do that? I'm not entirely sure, honestly, but I found that those are the three questions that I like to ask people, and that those questions help guide people, maybe not even the person I'm interviewing, but someone listening to it, towards the things that they want to focus on in life. And speaking of interviews, in this episode, I'm chatting with host of the Chicago Staple, a live show called The Interview Show with Mark Bazer. That's right, I'm talking to Mark Bazer himself. He's been doing this show in Chicago for roughly 17 years, maybe exactly 17 years at this point, and it's a fantastic program. So fantastic that they are now launching a podcast edition called The Interview Show with Mark Bazer. Back when I lived in Chicago, I was lucky enough to perform on the show at least once, I think, and attend numerous times. I've seen him interview people like David Axelrod, and over the years, he's interviewed a wide range of politicians, actors like Ethan Hawke, comedians like Hannibal Buress, musicians like Jeff Tweedy, all in a way that feels uniquely Chicago, incredibly authentic, and is a breath of fresh air when it comes to the interview styles that we're so used to these days. So when I heard that he was launching the podcast version of the show, I thought there's no better time to bring him onto my podcast. So here it is, my conversation with Mark Bazer, which, by the way, was recorded in two separate locations, me in my apartment in Brooklyn and him at his job in Chicago. Nothing more Chicago than that. Let's say that we're starting here. You're talking to me from what may or may not technically be your day job. I don't know if it's one of those jobs where it's like
totally my day job.
Okay, yeah, it's fine for us to put this in the episode. They're not going to be like
100%. I mean and not that I'm like whatever super successful, but the reality is that I don't know what the percent is, but it's a very high percentage of people who are in bands or doing or whatever have day jobs. Like.
I thought you were going to say late night hosts. That the majority, a lot of people don't know this.
Yeah, people don't know that Kimmel is an insurance agent. They don't know it. For Geico, I think, already was a couple of years ago. Yeah.
But I'm glad that you bring this up because when I was in Chicago, this is the place where I really, for the first time, I might have done a couple random open mics in California. I met so many fantastic performers at night to the extent that I could not fathom what they did during the day. And it was kind of jarring for me to consider, what does this like guy or woman who's this fantastic comedian at night, just mind-blowing, what do they do during the day? I have no idea. And every now and then when I would find out, I would be like, really? That's it's just insane.
It may be particular to a place like Chicago as opposed to, and I have not lived there, but New York or LA, where there is something to be said for people going to New York or LA and like saying, I'm taking that full on risk. I am putting all my eggs in that basket. And there's also just a lot of just like, I would imagine going from friends I know out in both places, going from gig to gig and things like that. So those are day jobs too, right? They're just not like the full-time kind of thing. But yeah.
And your show, The Interview Show.
I don't mean that badly. I love it here. It's my home.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I'm just getting to the point in my life where it's like, oh yeah, of course that's the case. I don't know why. I was always the type of performer who never would mention my day job in my set. And I thought that was like an unwritten rule of it. And then later I was like, oh, tons of comics are talking about what they are totally fine with this blend. I had this weird concept that you're supposed to be this completely invented self on stage.
Well, I mean, I could see that. for sure. But if you've got good material about your day job, why
Yeah.
not?
Why
Right?
not?
And maybe that makes, I don't know, relate to the audience if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, yeah.
Or if you want to alienate them, maybe you go take another route.
Well, are you from Chicago?
No, I grew up in Boston, or right outside
Boston.
of Boston.
Okay.
Yeah, right outside. And then I lived there, and I was gonna stay there, and then there was a woman who I wanted to date who was in Minnesota, but we both went to school in Chicago, and I
Huh.
thought if I come to Chicago, maybe she will, and she did, and we're married.
Nice, nice.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, it worked
beautiful.
out. Worked
Yeah.
out. Yeah.
Well, the first time that I did, and maybe I only did it once, I don't recall the interview show at the Hideout, the show that you host. It was a big deal, and it still feels like a big deal. I was just looking at a bunch
Much
of the.
less, much less of a much smaller deal at this point. It just keeps going down. No, no. We've been doing it for 17
Well,
years.
that's incredible. But
Yeah.
it's a fantastic show. I will say, as someone who has written for a professional NBC late night show, that it's better in a lot of ways than than a lot of
I
the.
appreciate that.
It truly
I mean,
is.
they have to you have to do it there, and every day. That's just a
Yes, yes. But
animal.
I do think that what you do with that show is fantastic, and I'm sure that maybe there are parallels in other cities of people doing late night shows in this way. It's incredible that it's available on, PBS stations, and the conversations are authentic and real and not manufactured in the way that you typically see on late night shows.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah,
I mean, that is always. I guess late night shows. I think about that not a lot, but sometimes like they just don't have the time. It's
yeah,
just they're so quick those conversations, and obviously the volume of people that they're talking to, and I don't even But once in a while you get one, right? Like I
yeah,
remember Letterman would have. I mean, sometimes it'd be people who he clearly disagreed with and were kind of frustrating people, like Bill O'Reilly or something like that. But he would have these moments where you're like, this is what it could be.
yeah.
I mean, maybe it couldn't be all the time, but at its best, it's incredible.
Yes.
So
Well, and my path has taken me to a sort of full circle for in your own life. I feel at one point I was working at Comedy Central Digital, and one of my coworkers there was David Nagler, who you went to
uh,
college with.
we were roommates. Yeah, yeah. I speak to him all the time. I love
Yeah,
David. Yeah,
he's one of the best people.
he's done some stuff for the show too. He's been on the show just like you. He's been on the show a couple times. And the music that we still play,
Hmm.
that when in the live setting, when somebody is called up to stage, is music that he wrote. So it's like this loungy music that he gave me, which I'm forever appreciative of. Yeah, he's the best.
Yeah, he's the best. He's the best. And something that I'm increasingly interested in with people that I talk to is this sort of duality of the practical life and the creative life. So I think like talking about you working in an ad agency now
Hmm.
as your that's
Yep.
you during the day, and then at
Yep.
night you're this incredible professional interviewer.
Once in a while, yeah. Most nights I'm just sitting there,
But which one do you prefer? Which
sitting
one do
there.
you?
Oh, the day job, or well,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm definitely the day job. The day
Okay.
job is my pure passion. And then the talk show I do is just a real chore.
Well, what led you to this? What is it? What was the inspirational moment that said, you know what? I want to host a late night show. I will host a late night show. I'll
Yeah.
do it live in
Yeah.
Chicago.
At 6:30, not super late. But
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So the origin story, if you will, is like you were mentioning what TV talk shows, like you don't often get these kind of authentic conversations. But I'm a little older than you, but I'm younger than the audience for a show called The Dick Cavett Show.
Mm.
And but I came upon it at the time, I believe, through DVDs and then a lot of clips then later on YouTube. But I just became like enamored with it. That was
Yeah.
a show that was on PBS. And then I believe it might have also been on ABC. Dick Cavett, who was also from, like Carson from Nebraska, wrote for Johnny Carson show, I believe. And then he struck out on his own. But it was a totally different thing. I mean, he would have like these really long, interesting, often funny, but didn't have to be funny. He had
Yeah.
he's a very, very funny guy. Conversations with people like, I don't know. I mean, old timers, like Groucho Marx, Jimi
Yeah.
Hendrix, like you know what I mean? Like and it definitely felt unlike sometimes on TV that there, and this might have been also back then, it was a little bit different. People weren't as guarded, they
Yeah.
weren't as media trained, they didn't care, whatever it was. So they would have these conversations that would just go unpredictable places, right? And so that was part of it. And then I always, unlike you, I was I had written for years a humor column in various places, including a
Hmm.
paper in Chicago owned by the Tribune called Red Eye. But I was nervous. I did not like. I just like I always wanted to be on stage, but I didn't really want to do the stand up thing because probably out of just being nervous and not thinking I'd be good at it. And then the this idea of doing a talk show was just the like a nice middle, like a nice way in. And I went to the hideout where and I said to the owners, I'd like to do this. I presented this big proposal and everything like that. And I was like, I'd like to do it once and see how it goes. And they said to their, like, I'm forever thankful. They're like, well, you're going to have to just do it once a month. Don't just do it once because that's the only way to build an audience. And that's absolutely true. Like the first show was February of 2008. I can't believe it. The guests were, and I just totally lucked out. Like the guests were Hannibal Buress, who had just been like rated by Time Out Chicago, which is no longer around as a print magazine, as
Yeah.
Chicago's top stand-up, but he wasn't known in the way he is known now. John Green, who went on to write The Fault in Our Stars, and who I'd been friendly with and am friends with, but he had only had one book at that point to his name. And then this woman, Julie Smolyansky, who owns a company called Lifeway. They make, I love them, probiotic kefir drinks. And
Huh.
she went on to become like a sponsor of the show later. So like it was just like very serendipitous. And then, but the audience was friends and family and a few other people who probably were thinking they were seeing a different show. And then it did grow.
Yeah.
So they were right.
And what year was that?
2008.
2008.
Yeah.
That's so it was like well into like the show knew what it was by the time I was there because I think I moved to Chicago in 2012 and I must have done it maybe like 2014 or something like that. So it was
Yeah.
well established by then.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, the show I've put very little effort into growing it and maturing it. It's been pretty much
But
just
that's
as
great.
it was
It's
from the
just
first.
it is like I think everyone listening to this podcast should check it out because it is refreshing. I
Yeah.
think that there's something about the clinical nature of a lot of late night shows now where you kind of forget that this is something that's possible. And yeah, I'm curious to know, kind of backtracking a little bit, what was the first genre that called out to you as a kid? Was it somehow connected to comedy or the art of
Yeah.
interviewing?
I would not interviewing. I don't think so. Although there were two tracks to my life, I guess, in terms of what I was interested in. But the first genre as a kid was certain comedies, movies. In particular, my dad just loved the movie Airplane, and that became like it was one of those movies where back then like you weren't. I mean, there were VCRs, but we didn't own it. I don't think so. It was like it would come on TV once in a while, and then I remember as a kid always having to go to bed at a certain point in the movie. So I'd seen like the first half of Airplane or first two-thirds or whatever many times, and then
Huh.
eventually I saw the whole thing, and I loved it. And then when Naked Gun, same people, Zucker and Abrams, when that came out, I think it was what, like 89 or something like that. I was at the perfect age, like 13 years old. I remember going to a birthday party to see it in the theater, and it was like the cliche. I like fell out of my seat into the aisle laughing during, if people remember, the baseball scene at the end. Um, and I think those movies more, and that, I mean, they're not the only ones that made those type of movies, but they were the best. And those people who made those spoofs, like that just wasn't the only thing. Like I think your humor is shaped mostly probably by your friends
Yeah.
and maybe the time you're growing up. But those movies meant so much. It still do mean. In fact, last year for an event, I got to interview them. They had written a book
Oh
about
wow.
making the
Yeah.
Airplane. Yeah, so like one of maybe the biggest like interviewing thrill of my life. And so those movies, I think that's like, if you want to call that the genre of spoof comedy.
Spoofs.
Yeah, I mean, just the idea that you could also, and if I could, like, I don't want, nobody wants to listen to anybody analyze Airplane, but like, if you can do a movie, like people, I always like, one of the things people often say is, oh, that's such a dumb movie, but it is the smartest dumb movie. It is
Yeah.
so smart, right? And uh, and then there's all the other stuff like. I mean, just little wordplay stuff. Like they made the movie, the Kentucky Fried Movie, which was they didn't direct it. I think what was the guy's name that directed? Famous director. But they wrote it, and it was based in part on their show that they had done. They were Midwestern. They were from Milwaukee, and they were out in L.A. And there's this one line they're doing. I love this line. This epitomizes it. Like they're doing this long parody of like Bruce Lee movies, and they're showing they're in a room. People are in a room looking at who these potential enemies are on like a film strip, like a screen, and they say to one guy, "This guy is tough and ruthless," and he looks like that. They show the next guy, and they're like, "This guy is rough and toothless," and he looks like that. And just like what brilliance that was. Like, how can you just not just
Yeah.
like lose some, just forget things for a second and laugh, right?
So what inspired you from that? Like, was it just like a mind blowing kind of thing? Like you didn't know a movie like this was possible?
Well, I mean, I was too young to like not know that, it wasn't like I was like, I've been studying film history for years. This came along. Like it just was part of growing up. But I guess I just spoke. It was just like what I liked. And it wasn't what I, ended up pursuing, although in some ways it was. Like I was also at the same time getting really into journalism and newspapers, and that was like a huge part of my high school. And then into college when I started writing a humor column in college. And so I think whether, in no way did it measure up in terms of how funny it was compared to the funniest movies of all time. But
yeah,
but that sensibility, I think I took that sensibility with me, if that makes sense.
You earlier on you mentioned a couple things that gave me a wave of nostalgia, talking about the Chicago Red Eye. That was a daily paper, right? Is that still in existence?
No. Yeah, it was. Yeah, that was. Yep, that paper was around for a while. I have very thankful for the chance they gave me. So.
It was fantastic. When I lived in Chicago, I could pick up a free Onion paper. I could pick up a daily Red Eye paper. I could pick up a weekly Chicago Reader paper, all for free. And it was normal to see people reading them on the train. And ever since, I've been missing that. Like in New York, I never see anyone reading. I don't think there is any equivalent to those.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me. I mean, no, there was in New York. They had their own. They came out with their own version of that. I forget the name of it.
Okay.
But that was a thing for a moment. Like we don't need to get into the whole history of why those papers came out. But yeah, I mean, now I could talk forever and sound like such a bitter old person.
Well, I'm the exact same way, because there's no equivalent to it in the digital spaces. It hasn't been replicated by any stretch of the imagination, and I think that's the sad part. Because when I would have working with friends to have a comedy show or something, and if it got featured in the Reader or in the Red Eye, there was like a guarantee that people would show up.
How do you? It's just something I wrestle with all the time now, because I have an audience of people who I know the show, who have come to the show, but and maybe it's partially getting older. I will recognize that, but you're right. Like, how do you get the word out to people who don't know, who aren't in your social media circle?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously people do, and maybe it's just a question of working harder or booking the right people.
But it requires too much search for everybody. It requires too much luck in search. Whereas, like, you knew that, like, if you want something to do while you're on the train, of course I'm going to pick up this paper, and it's like, of course there are people who work there who make sure it's appetizing in all the right ways, and that's how I find out.
I used to buy Facebook ads for my show. And then at one point I asked the audience, I said, like, how many people here are here because of the Facebook ad? And I think I asked that a few times, and never once was there one person. So that was just money I gave Mark Zuckerberg for no reason.
Definitely, definitely. But there is something to, so you're interested in journalism as well. It seems like there is like that sort of ability, especially in the on the humor end, to parody seriousness, to parody the genre that is the seriousness of a type of film or the seriousness of a type of article.
Oh yeah,
Did you find any parallels as you pursued that? You had an
yeah,
earnest interest in journalism, but you're also doing humor pieces, things like that.
yeah. I mean, so and that's maybe tees up to where you want to go, like, or where we can go with this. Like, I when I got to college, I there was a bookstore that's no longer in Evanston called Bookman's Alley, and it was this. They had this mostly used books, maybe all used books, and they had this one section of old humor books. And we're talking like I had liked. Do you know who Dave Barry is? Like I
Yeah,
had really
yeah.
liked Dave Barry, but this was going back further to people like Robert Benchley and
Uh,
S.J. Perlman. I mean, these are
yes.
like really
I love
old.
S.J. Perlman as well. I mean, I feel like I've been Woody Allen was a big influence for me as well.
Yeah, his
Even
prose
though,
was yeah,
yeah,
you know, yeah, but his
yeah,
prose was very funny.
yes, yes, yes,
And
and even like the types of comedy movies that you're talking about, like I think about like Bananas and Take the Money and Run. Like
uh,
it's a
yeah,
style of comedy movie that it feels like it can't exist anymore, maybe, but where it's like so heavily going for it's a premise comedy, a smart premise comedy, I guess is the best way to say it.
yeah. I mean, that's right. Like I fell in love with. I started buying those books. I started reading them when I probably should have been, reading other like they weren't assigned or anything.
Yeah,
And it was like that was kind of a revelation for me, and that's really what like I wanted to pursue. That became kind of my passion. There was a guy, I'll mention one other guy because nobody will ever mention him, named Max Schulman,
uh,
and he wrote a show. He created a show that was famous called The Adventures, I think, of Dobie Gillis. I think it was called. But he
mm,
wrote these humor books that, and I find that maybe you would think this too. Like, what is it there? And there's some comedy that in the moment or for 10 years it's funny, and then 50 years later or 25 years later it just doesn't resonate. It doesn't work.
yeah,
Might be read it and say, oh, I can understand that is funny, but you're
yeah,
not laughing. And then there's certain comedy, and I can't figure out why, that you still laugh about. Like I would say, like for when I watch, well before any of our time, like when I watch like a Charlie Chaplin movie, I'm like, oh my
yeah,
god, that's still so funny. But then there's other stuff that could be made in the '80s where you're like, I don't know about that anymore.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And I found with Max Schulman that not only could I appreciate it, but I was like, God, somehow this guy like transcends, at least for me, and maybe that's not true anymore, time. Like
yeah,
he wrote this book called Barefoot Boy with Cheek, which sounds actually very, very old fashioned.
yeah, yeah,
But the book is about a kid at college experiencing his first year, I think, at the University of Minnesota. And I haven't read it in years, but I remember reading it and being like, well, this book was written in what, like the 50s or 60s or something. And then
yeah.
I'm here in the 90s reading it. And then I read it later, maybe in the early 2000s. And I'm like, God, this book, it still feels fresh. It still feels right. So that became and then writing those and that's what I started doing in college. And then that's what I wanted to do. That's what I want. I thought I could make a living. Right. I mean,
Writing humor.
crazy,
Yeah,
stupid thought. Not just humor, but like newspaper humor essays. Like I thought
yeah,
that was a viable
yeah, yeah.
career path.
So that was the first official craft that you pursued. Would you say that?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Yeah.
How in the world did you go about pursuing that?
Well, you just write them,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, you read them,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then you are somewhat,
Because certain people do
feel
get that position. Some people
yeah,
get
and
that. Yeah.
yeah, no, there are 3 people who have that position, yeah. Um, I did, so I wrote the column for Red Eye,
Uh,
and then it was syndicated.
yeah.
So it was in, like, Bozeman, Montana,
Uh,
and I think it was in that New York commuter paper, actually. It
okay.
was in, like,
Okay.
50 markets. I mean, like,
Nice.
it
I didn't
didn't
realize that.
meet
Yeah.
yeah, nobody did. Uh, but it was, I did it for years. But it wasn't my full-time job. Like that was the other thing. Going back
Yeah.
to what we started at the beginning, like it was never going to pay the rent. But I love doing it. I love the art. Art is too strong. I love the act of it's almost like putting together a puzzle where you're making the pieces at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Like you're trying to make everything fit together. You're trying to, and I mean, I haven't thought about this too much, but like, you want to, obviously, with the newspaper, people can quickly turn the page. You want to like bring them in.
Yeah.
You want to, and this is something that I think I learned from people like you, like stand-ups and watching, you guys, like, you can't, unless you're, I mean, there's certain people like obviously like Dave Chappelle or somebody who does it, but like you really want to have jokes frequently. Like
Yes.
yeah, like
Every 5 to
yeah,
10 seconds, some sort of
yeah,
joke. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So that's something that, and the way that happened actually was I think I wrote a bunch of columns that didn't have that, and I'm not saying they were bad. They might have been more like storytelling or something.
Mm.
But then I would go and there were like Chicago had, I'm sure other places had, and it still has, but it had at one point like this really good like live lit scene,
Mm.
and that's actually kind of where my show grew out of, having done that at the Hideout, the show called Funny Haha,
Mm.
and you get up on stage and you read. I'd see other people do it, and I'd see myself do it. I'd read a column
Yeah.
that didn't have those jokes, and people might like it, but I didn't know because they weren't laughing, and you need. Like then you
Yeah,
walk
you
off, you slump off stage. You're like, "Okay." So then I was like, well, if I'm going to deliver these live or even eventually, memorize them, like I need to just make sure it's just bang, bang, bang. And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
that was, I went off course there.
Yeah,
But,
I'm fascinated by comedy writers who like purely comedy writers, pen to paper, ink to paper, who don't perform at all. And I've met a few like that, and like that is mind blowing to me. Reading their work and truly believing, like laughing at it. It's amazing that it's possible without that experience.
I'll tell you, so you were mentioning that this jogged my memory, like red eye, you were like, people read it on the train. And once in a while, I'd be on the train with somebody near somebody reading my column. And like sometimes you'd see people laughing, and no feeling is better than that.
Yeah,
Other times, very much the opposite. Like they wouldn't throw it down in anger, but
yeah,
they'd
yeah,
be
yeah.
like stone faced.
And then they look up
And
at
you'd just
you.
be like,
That is like, oh
yeah,
my god, that's
you'd just be
kind
like, oh no.
of.
They don't even know it's humor because it obviously hasn't succeeded.
Don't scroll away. You Are the Genre. We'll be right back after the break. Here we are in the middle of the show where I remind you that You Are the Genre is a listener-supported podcast. That means that, I mean, I could use your support, I guess. It's a lot of weird work doing a podcast on your own. I, book the guest, I edit the episodes, I figure out when to release them, and you got to promote them all over the place. So I do this, for the love of great conversation, but also for the pleasure of bringing those conversations to you. If you like to support the podcast, there's a few ways that you can do it. First, and probably most importantly, you can just leave a nice rating and review wherever you're listening to it. That kind of stuff goes a long way. It helps other people find the show. You can also subscribe to the newsletter associated with the podcast. There's a link to that in your show notes. You can just visit youarethegenre.com also to give you a quick link to where you can subscribe to that. There is a free version of the newsletter, which gives you regular updates on the latest publicly available episodes and other things. But there's also a paid tier, which gives you advanced episodes of the podcast, plus so much more. So this week, for instance, if you were to upgrade to the paid version of the newsletter and go to the You Are the Genre tab, you can listen to my conversation with sci-fi author Micaiah Johnson. That's going to come out next week. Or you can listen to my interview with comedian and filmmaker and TV writer Niles Abston, all unedited, raw. I also use this break in the show to talk about something that I've simply been enjoying, because that's what the show is all about, chasing that spark of joy and seeing how that travels with you throughout your life. What about this? Recently, I've been listening to a lot of the Duke Ellington album, Blues in Orbit. Blues in Orbit, I think, is maybe his best record. And when I say his, I'm talking about Duke Ellington and his orchestra. Something about it feels very live, even though it's recorded in a studio. And I don't know, so many of the songs just have a great groove to them, and you can just hear everyone having a good time. And if you want to be, someone like me, and am I an elder millennial now? I'm 36. Try putting something like that on in the car. Bump some in a mellow tone at the red light. See how the other cars next to you react. So there you have it. Leave the podcast a nice rating and review. Listen to some Duke Ellington, perhaps, Blues in Orbit. and consider subscribing to the newsletter associated with the podcast. If you'd like to do that last thing, get all of the information you need at youarethegenre.com. Now, back to the episode. Where were we? I mean, I think a lot about how the medium changes just about everything.
Like I felt I was never good when Twitter was good. I was never, it wasn't the medium for me. I don't know. Like I needed somehow, maybe it was getting caught up in my head or afraid of putting it out, like, or nervous or whatever. But like, I just felt that that quick, some people are so, you're great at it. Like, fortunately the platform is not,
I know,
but like, but some people I'm just like, God, that is just, there's so much genius on it, or was on it. And yet that, like, I don't know, it felt different than the newspaper column humor genre, where you needed really to, like, or you wanted to let something kind of unfurl, kind of.
Yeah.
Over 700 words or whatever it was.
And it's also funny how, like, Twitter kind of gobbled up a certain type of, again, like, the medium kind of changes everything. So I think, if I remember correctly, Zach Galifianakis's, I think it might have been, maybe it's his, I think he did a premium blend maybe for Comedy Central, but his Netflix special, Live at the Purple Onion, I believe that came out like the same year that Twitter launched, or like the year after. So that's fascinating, because when you watch it now, it feels like, from a modern perspective, he's just saying tweets out loud. But this is before the concept of tweets had really caught on. And so being a one-liner comic in that style kind of has to go out of fashion to a certain degree, because of how accessible it is for us to find these, like, quick burst jokes all over the place.
Interesting. Right. Like, think about, I actually saw him once, very, like, when he was probably around that time, like, Donnie's Skybox at Second City.
Second City,
playing the piano, doing his thing. And I didn't know him. And somehow we were there. And I remember just being so blown away. So, like, oh my God, I'm so glad I'm here right now. So you're right. Like, something like growing up, like Stephen Wright, who, I mean, on the one hand, like, I mean, that it's a shame, right? If there's people now who could have had, like, full-fledged Stephen Wright careers, but instead are just, it's 50 tweets. That's the most depressing thing I've ever heard. Thanks.
Instead, it's 50 tweets. That's a great name for a stand-up special.
Yeah. Tonight I'll be performing 50 tweets.
But it's really cool that you had the experience of being a newspaper columnist, because that's like one of those fantasy professions that people want, even though it's hard to, like, it's like you had an element of being Carrie Bradshaw in Chicago.
Yes, very much so. I was very much the Carrie Bradshaw of Chicago. That was the ads on all the bus benches. Benches.
Okay, so that was your first pursuit.
Lack of sex in the city.
Yeah, there we go. And you did it. You set out to do it, and then at some point you did it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
You ever find these moments as an interviewer where you're like, okay, how do I get back on track? That's why I asked the same three questions.
That's why editing software exists.
Yeah. And so let's circle back to the reason we know each other, which is the interview show.
Yeah.
How do you feel, just to kind of combine that with what the last question of the show is? The last question of the show is, how do you feel about that first pursuit? But I want to know how you feel at this point of the interview show, having done it for, you said 16 years now?
Yeah, whatever, 2008. 17th year right now, yeah. I feel great, honestly. Like, I on the one hand, I'm not, like we were joking before, like, I'm not Jimmy Kimmel. Like, I haven't, if somebody wants to offer me that, I will do it. But I'm also, like, I realized pretty early on that you cannot do anything, and I'm not just saying this, like, this is real, like, you cannot do something like that if you don't just enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
right? Like it has to um, be that. And I've also like the show has, and the other part of that is, and I joked before that it hasn't grown or anything like that, but like every few years, or maybe it's more than that or less, like how can I change up the show in ways that feel exciting? So for years it was on PBS, and then now we have a podcast. And we also do it at a place called Fitzgerald's. We do it at both the Hideout and Fitzgerald's, and that's changed up at Fitzgerald's. It's changed up the format a little. And then just getting excited about who you get to book, right? I love that kind of chase, like that, like, and then when you land somebody, how good it feels, to get to
Yeah. I mean, you've had David Duchovny, you've had Hebrew Brantley, you've had like an
yeah, yeah,
incredible roster.
yeah. It's been, and so, and like it also, and I don't mean this. It's going to sound very dramatic, but it did change my life. Like it made me in both in ways that were practical. Like it actually, and I love my day job, and it led to my day job. Like
Mm.
it directly led to my day job. That's another story, but and it also just changed how I think felt about myself or felt about what I could do. Like again, could I get on stage?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, how it is, right? Like before you do it, you're like, can I do it? And then once you've done it, hopefully if you've done it pretty well, you're like, yeah. And then that's a feeling. So.
Yeah. Well, I often think about, how we were talking about earlier about like comics who have like day jobs, and me as a young comic having no idea how to comprehend that. I often think about the sort of superhero feeling of that. Like, you're this incredible personality at night, and then you go to whatever potentially lousy job, and you're like, no one knows who I was last night. It's such a great feeling. And I think that what you bring to the late night aesthetic is this sort of, it is sort of like a Peter Parker energy.
Yes.
Maybe it's the journalist in you, but
Yeah.
it is a bit of that. It's hard hitting in a certain way. You have like very serious politicians. I think once I saw you interviewing David Axelrod, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. It was
yeah,
great.
yeah.
That was a fun show. Yeah.
And so it brings the community together. And more I think about it, do you ever? I mean, it seems like Seth Meyers kind of stole a little bit of your style. He doesn't wear the suit. You don't wear the suit.
Yeah. I mean, other people don't wear suits.
I know, but
I love Seth Meyers. Seth Meyers I didn't know him, but we both went to Northwestern. He was a year below
okay.
me.
So maybe that's what it is. The same Northwestern
Maybe.
energy
Yeah, and he's both, and I believe, I can't
from
remember. I think he's
Boston.
from New England. Well, I don't think he's from Boston. He might be from New Hampshire.
Oh yeah,
Maybe,
yeah.
maybe.
That sounds
I
right.
love him.
Yeah.
I think he's great. So I'll take that comp any day.
Nice.
Yeah.
And so then for the that first pursuit, how do you feel about that first pursuit of being a humor writer?
I was worried you were going to ask that because you told me you were going to ask it. I I don't want to sound like curmudgeonly here at all. So because here's the thing, like I think I'm not doing that as much. I still write opening bits
Yeah.
for my show, which is essentially that, but I'm not doing it like at the weekly cadence I did for 10 years. And um there's part of me that's like, obviously people are writing great humor, whether it's, whether it's in honest, like a Substack or something like that, right? Like
Mhm.
that's happening. There's no doubt about it. So
Yeah.
I don't want to pretend that that's not true. But here's the curmudgeonly part. I do honestly, sincerely kind of am sad by the fact that newspapers aren't what newspapers were,
Yeah.
right? Like there's so many people that I looked up to, um, some of whom are still around and some of whom aren't. That meant so much to me. And reading a newspaper meant so much to me. And we
Mm.
touched on it a little earlier, but the idea of like reading a newspaper on the train and everybody reading essentially not the same thing, but possibly the same thing, and
Yeah.
having that like weird shared experience. And there's different shared experiences now, I realize, but also, there is, this is not a unique thought here, but there's so much, um, everybody's in their own everybody's in their genre, to quote,
Yeah.
your podcast, right? Like, so I think I'm sure we've gained a lot, maybe, but
Mm.
we've lost a lot, I think. And I think yeah, now, I mean, obviously there's still newspapers, but I mean, I'm not reading a print newspaper. I'm reading it on the phone,
Yeah.
and it's
And
definitely, we don't have stacked papers in our house, but I kind of like that. I kind of like
yeah.
stacked.
And does it ever feel like part of it is like preconceived embarrassment of opening up a newspaper on the train? Like I would love to open up, but I feel like I'd be
Yeah,
the only person.
yeah, you'd have to like dress in an old-fashioned way to maybe. I don't know.
But you're right. I often think
Yeah,
about this too. There is something. It's like a New Yorker cartoon is funnier in print than it is on the screen, and there is
yeah,
something about there's something about
100%. Yeah,
lingering on the page. Like your eyes just stay on the page longer than it stays on anything that you scroll through. Like
yeah.
it's
And
it's
again, I think there is a certain, I'll use the word again, art form to any newspaper, not any newspaper article, but certain kinds of newspaper articles, and certainly the humor column. Like if you go
yeah.
back and you read the best, and I'll like shout out some of my like no like shout out and mentioning these people, those terms don't even exist in the same world. But people like Russell Baker, who, I mean, this is years ago, right? Like, but he wrote a column for the New York Times for decades, right? So funny, and individual works of art. Calvin Trellin, like
Hmm.
just these people that make me sound old, but they are so good. Nora Ephron. I mean, Nora
Mhm.
Ephron wrote the best humorous essays ever.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Like, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know, I know they're out there. I know they are. But they're not packaged in
They're not
in this
packaged,
thing.
and it also feels like there was a stability to that medium, whereas every app is evolving by the minute. Like Facebook today doesn't look like Facebook last year, doesn't look like Facebook 5 years ago,
Yeah.
and there are all these new bells and whistles, but paper bound together, there's not too much you can do.
No.
There's not, and so you can attack that. You can actually attack that and try and do something different. Like the stale format of late night allows a comic to appear and try and mess with that stable format.
Oh, interesting. I like that.
But
Yeah, I
when
like
the
that.
format itself is constantly changing, I feel like that is like the prime issue. There's nothing to parody at some point.
That's fascinating. I love that. I love. No, I do. I like that insight a lot. Yeah. Or yeah, play with the form, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The form is playing with
Absolutely.
you.
That's a comedy special there.
There. God, I feel like Dick Cavett could be interviewing me right now. No.
Let me tell you this. We had our 10th anniversary. I'll tell you this story. We had our 10th anniversary show, and a while ago. And my wife Gina, she in the middle of the show, we're doing it live at the Hideout. One of the guys that had worked with me, Adam, comes up, pulls down the janky screen at the Hideout, and there is a video that my wife had somehow got of Dick Cavett congratulating
Oh
me
my
on our
God.
10-year anniversary. Yeah, it was
That's
such a beautiful
absolutely
thing that she did, and he said really like, and it looked like he had actually like took the time to watch a couple of interviews that we
wow.
videotaped to just yeah, it
Yeah,
was special.
that's incredible. Dick Cavett of Beetlejuice fame took the time. He's in Beetlejuice. How have I found something that you've never watched? All these incredible references. You've never seen Beetlejuice?
I know, isn't that crazy? I'll fix it this week.
Yeah,
Have
yeah.
me back on,
You
and we'll
got.
just do a deep dive.
I think he's only
And
in
there's
one scene.
another one
He's
now.
yeah. Another one
I'll
came
just
out.
watch that.
Yeah,
Can we just watch that? I know it's a great movie. I know it is. I loved it. It was great. I loved it. Oh, he was great in
yeah. Well, how do you feel about bringing the show into the podcast medium? This must be the first time. I'm surprised that it hasn't.
Yeah, well, I'm a little cheating there. We tried it at one point, and then I just kind of gave up. But now I'm in it.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, it sounds so stupid to be saying like I'm doing a podcast now that there are 8 gazillion and
Yeah.
17 years after doing it. But we're just going to put up stuff from the live show, and we might put up stuff from the past.
Nice.
And then we just have one up now, and it is the first one is with Robert Sean Leonard, who was in House, was in Dead Poet Society, and now he's in a play at the Goodman
Nice.
Theater in Chicago. And I just found out this is actually, I believe this is actually true. For some reason, it is ranked in the top 10 in Bahrain
Wow.
arts genre.
All right.
And I think it might be because I have a friend who comes to show a lot who is
Hmm.
working in Bahrain, and it
Okay.
might just be like his one listen that put it into the
Maybe
top.
that's it. Or maybe
Yeah.
he took some time and bought you a nice billboard.
Oh, that might be it. Yeah.
Well, I had a question that escaped me. I'm going to pause to see if it pops up.
Yeah,
But if not,
let's just wait
I
and
think
find.
yeah,
Yeah,
have a little moment of silence for that question.
yeah. Do you want me to try to guess what the question was?
Yeah, maybe. Try and.
That's the new talk show.
That's it.
That's my question. I'm thinking of a question. What is it? If you get it right, we'll continue with the conversation.
I think, yeah, sorry. I had a little.
I'm really thrilled to be on this. I really,
Yeah, this is.
I've
Yeah.
followed. Well, I followed you before. Then you were on the show, enjoyed it. Then I've been following you since, and enjoy.
Thank you.
You're super fun.
You're incredible. And I think that you're part of a great Chicago tradition. You're part of a great Chicago
Oh,
pantheon.
nobody wants to be part of a great Chicago.
No, but seriously, I mean, I've been listening to some Studs Terkel interviews, and it's wild. Like, he really was like a specific precursor to like the podcast style interview. Like, listening to his conversation with Ray Bradbury, and it is so casual. There's not that sort of that typical radio flair that you assume will pop up from a radio conversation. And I think that your conversations are
I
similar
met
to
him
that.
once. I met.
Oh, nice.
Once. Yeah. My uncle was friendly with him. My uncle owned a bookstore in Evanston. There was an event. I don't know what the event was for, but Studs was there. And the one thing I remember was that he was very hard of hearing at that point, and my wife has a very high voice, and her voice was like a dog whistle to him. Like,
Wow.
he just could not. He actually could not hear her. Like, he could hear me, but he could not hear me.
So it's a great memory for you, not so great for your wife.
No, I think she enjoyed that too. Yeah.
She's like, it's.
He might not have. I don't even think I don't think he liked it. But
yeah. Yeah. So then she just started cursing him out, and with a smile, and he had no idea.
She could have said anything. Yeah.
Well, this is such a great conversation. I'm glad that you're still at everything that you're still at.
Yeah.
And I believe in you.
Oh my God. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's the podcast. Big thanks to Mark Bazer for joining me on the show. For more information about him, visit theinterviewshowchicago.com. Freddie Nunez created and sings the You Are the Genre theme song, and Adam Smith produced it. Next episode, I'm talking to sci-fi author Micaiah Johnson. And if you become a paid subscriber to the newsletter, you can listen to that right now. This is Tim Barnes signing off with your weekly reminder that you are the genre.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. But we can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what's your genre, tell me what do you do. I'd like to know the things that specifically make you you.